And let me make sure that I also feed you with sound input. Thank you again for inviting me to address you on this occasion. Thank you for choosing a subject that is very close to UNESCO's concerns. Thank you for mapping the general bureaucratic structure of UNESCO, which is a reminder that the key letters of the acronym, education, science and culture, correspond to particular bureaucratic units within the Secretariat. But of course, the bureaucratic divisions are not divisions of knowledge or mandate or action. On the contrary, in order to deliver on education, science and culture, it is absolutely crucial to consider the connections between them and to develop the synergies. This is precisely the subject that we are dealing with today, and I'd like to take it from a specific angle using, as you will see, the example of the geological notion of the Anthropocene, which has become in the recent literature not just a geological notion but a profoundly philosophical one, to illustrate how, in a sense, the gap is always already bridged, much more than we think, but at the same time specific steps are required to bridge it. What are the gaps between science and culture? Let me perhaps start with some general considerations on that in order to show that they're probably not as big as they're sometimes made out to be, but that they nonetheless do require some effort. For that, let me take just three references for convenience. Three ways of thinking about the gap from the very standard literature that have been proposed as ways of understanding how science and culture, and in particular culture considered not just as webs of beliefs and practices embedded in ordinary life, but as a science of culture, a sophisticated way of understanding its nature and modes of development, might sit in different universes. One of the first and most famous approaches to this is Dilthey's distinction between the sciences of nature and the sciences of mind. That distinction is intended to suggest that they have fundamentally different epistemological status, because the sciences of mind, the humanities and the social sciences, deal with agents that are themselves the producers of knowledge. It is second-order reflexive knowledge, whereas the sciences of nature are sciences of things that, as we might say, do not answer back. When you study quarks or lakes or ocean currents, they don't care. Or so at least we were used to think. I'll come back to this in a moment. They don't care. They don't react to the fact of being studied. Though of course they may react to the technological interventions we make on them as a consequence of studying them. But that's a different issue. That's about the systemic functioning of the relation between human action and natural systems. What they do not do is take the knowledge you produce about them and produce their own amateur, native knowledge. By contrast, every time you produce any kind of sociological theory of humans, through processes of teaching and media transmission and popularization, those ideas will be picked up by the people themselves and turned into practical everyday culture. Basically, every one of the big ideas of early 20th century sociology is today a cliché. Every journalist uses it. And people use it in ways they don't fully understand, but still it becomes part of ordinary language. An excellent example of the way in which technical vocabulary becomes part of popular culture, and this is the bridge to the second way of distinguishing, is the word charisma. Many of you may know that the popularization of the phrase, the word charisma, from the Greek meaning gift, comes from Max Weber's analysis or typology of modes of legitimacy. Charismatic authority being one of Weber's archetypal or ideal typical kinds of authority. Of course, charisma, as has often been pointed out, was picked up as a nice word by popular culture very quickly in the 1920s and became, over the decades, a way of basically defining what makes a pop star a pop star. That isn't exactly what Max Weber had in mind when he was trying to understand the different modes of legitimacy or authority. But it's very much part of how social science permeates popular culture. So that distinction between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften has a kind of common sense validity based in the epistemological nature of the relation between knowledge and the objects of knowledge. First possibility. The second comes precisely from Weber, which is why charisma is a useful bridge to it. Another one of Weber's very well-known contributions to general sociology was his idea that the process of rationalization of religion and the process of development of science, which he sees as very closely related to one another, have the effect, if not always the intention. Not all scientists are anti-religious or hostile to the idea of fundamental mysteries, on the contrary. But the effect of science, whatever the intentions of its practitioners, is to create what Weber called disenchantment. An enchanted world is one where, in principle, anything could happen. It is the world of magic. Magic has rules, of course. It's not true that literally anything could happen, whatever you do. Indeed, sorcerers, magicians, the technologists of the occult need a certain kind of predictability to their outcomes if they are to retain their social legitimacy. But still, in principle, even something no sorcerer has ever done could be done. You've probably read the Harry Potter cycle. It's all about this, pushing the boundaries of magic. Magic is a codified technology that is taught in a school and regulated by a ministry, but at the same time, dark sorcerers can always push its boundaries. And the question of why they shouldn't is never asked in the books. The books aren't very sophisticated in that respect. But in the same way that we often consider that pushing the boundaries of science is simply science, though we may worry about the technological applications, why shouldn't the same be true in a magical universe? Probably because at some kind of deep archetypal level, which J.K. Rowling was reacting to, even if not theorizing, the whole point of a magical universe, and this is Weber's point, is that in principle anything might be possible. Because the laws of magic are not abstract scientific laws. They are very concrete laws embedded in specific modes of social practice and embodied in specific practitioners. The knowledge is not transmissible in the abstract, impersonal way that scientific knowledge is. By contrast, once we have a world of science in which even religion has become subjected to science, as, according to Weber and others, Christianity was during the 18th and 19th century in Europe, then we have a disenchanted world where there is a body of knowledge, an impersonal body of knowledge, in principle accessible to anyone, that tells you that some things simply cannot happen, however much you may desire them, however much they may matter to you. You want the time travel machine, and we have so many reasons to want a time travel machine in order to undo our mistakes. But physicists, at least for the moment, tell you in the current state of physics, impossible. The possibility that some future revolution in physics might change the boundaries of possibility is, of course, always open. And the same would be true of all the other things that we would like magic to enable us to achieve. And the third example, a rather different one, is from C.P. Snow in a famous book called The Two Cultures, which was an attempt in the 1950s in Britain to understand why Britain was basically an underperforming economy. And Snow's idea, his basic point, was that Britain suffered more than other societies, supposedly, from a split between science and the humanities, which led to the production of political leaders with very little scientific training and a fundamental disconnect in public discourse and the organization of the university between the disciplines that are designed to give meaning to things, the humanities in the broad sense, and the disciplines that are designed to describe and transform the world, the sciences in the broad sense. Putting it in very simple terms, we have an epistemological distinction, an existential distinction, and a sociological distinction. And they point in the same direction. And the reason why we worry about the gap is precisely because these contributions are just some among the many who have attempted to put their finger on the nature and reasons of some fundamental gap in worldviews, in methods, in modes of social organization, and in implications for the organizations of societies. This is the gap. So at least we say, a gap between a mechanistic view, supposedly the view of science, and a holistic or multidimensional view, supposedly the view not exactly of culture, but of the disciplines that analyze culture and embed themselves in the concrete reality of culture. A supposedly value-neutral science compared with culture which is all about values, both in the sense of the background prejudices and assumptions of societies and in the sense of the more sophisticated disciplinary approaches to culture, which are all about the production of values and the critical understanding of values, and science supposedly oriented towards technologies of control and transformation through the connection between science and engineering and the other application disciplines, whereas the cultural disciplines and more generally culture itself, insofar as it is reflexive, would be oriented towards patterns of understanding. Now, as you can imagine, by setting it up this way, I'm going to suggest that this probably isn't entirely adequate, and that it may even be, in a number of respects, profoundly wrong. You only set up this kind of binary opposition to knock it down. Let me try to explain why there might be good reasons to knock this down. The first and most general is simply that by the very terms of this opposition, science is a cultural phenomenon. Indeed, science is a culture. Not the science itself in the sense of the practices, both abstract, intellectual rules of scientific conduct and the concrete rules that govern the organization of scientific communities, but science in the way in which it shapes a worldview and comes to stand for a certain organization of the human relation to the cosmos and to the natural beings that inhabit it, including other human beings. The whole point of the distinctions, including the ones I pointed to in the previous slide, is that science, particularly since the revolutions of the 17th century, has become a worldview, a philosophy, a culture, which has effects far beyond the professional practices of science, both in terms of the technologies that transform what it is to be human, and the discourses that reshape understandings of what it is to be human. And indeed, until certainly the middle of the 19th century, perhaps beyond, many of the distinctions that I pointed to would have been regarded as deeply misleading, because they would be neglecting the reflexive relationship between the production of scientific knowledge and how it changes the nature of the human position in the world. Indeed, to borrow a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, the scientist and science fiction writer, a quote that's often quoted in other contexts, any sufficiently advanced technology, said Clarke, is indistinguishable from magic. What he meant by that is, of course, first, that knowing how to use it doesn't require understanding how it works, which is the whole point, both of magic and of technology. If everyone had to know exactly how the technology works in order to use it, then it wouldn't be technology. It would be something else. But more importantly, the idea of enchantment, and this goes back to Weber's distinction, is presented as a kind of one-way street, where gradually over time, the magical forms that shape our thinking, based partly on ignorance of science, partly on the power of the background worldviews that give us the desire for a magical universe, are stripped away, so that the only thing that is left at the end is disenchantment. But if Clarke is even half right, and there are very good practical reasons to think that he probably is, then this is a more complex process whereby at every stage of scientific development, certain things become normalized and internalized into societies in such a way that what in a previous generation might have been regarded as science and technology open to the understanding of the non-specialist becomes, for all practical purposes, magic. But magic that may, at some later point, itself be disenchanted by new forms of understanding. And this backwards and forwards relationship, which is not about the science itself, but about how the science interacts with society, how the patterns and webs of technology shape the science-society relationship, is something more complicated, more reflexive, and more provisional than any simple process of disenchantment. This doesn't necessarily mean that there is no gap whatsoever, but it certainly means that if there is a gap, it is something that probably has a less clear-cut epistemological nature, a less clear-cut existential nature, and is embedded in institutional and sociological facts that are more complex and more provisional, and perhaps more diverse from place to place and from time to time than we often consider. And in particular, the idea that there is a fundamental distinction between what natural scientists do and what social and human scientists do is at least questionable. Indeed, the idea that what social and human scientists do isn't science at all, which is often held not so much, I think, by natural scientists as by science policy advisors who don't know very much about either, apologies for being mildly polemical, is itself a misunderstanding of the epistemological nature of the scientific enterprise itself. This, of course, is incredibly crude, incredibly simplistic, and just designed to point to the ways in which there is more in common between the different forms of scientific endeavor than is sometimes realized in public debate. Any science combines in a certain way theories, which are the condition for the formulation of hypotheses, instrumentation, and the use of instrumentation in the context of theory to make observations. Sometimes the instrumentation is specifically constructed for the purposes of the observation. Sometimes it pre-exists and is simply mobilized. A very good example being the human eye and human ear, which are observation instruments, which were not designed specifically to conduct experiments, but of course can, in the relevant field of validity and within the technical constraints. But that combination of theory, instrumentation, observation doesn't itself make anything scientific. Think again of sorcerers and magicians. They certainly have theories, they certainly have instruments, and they certainly observe and produce things that can be observed. What is distinctively scientific about the connection between those three poles is the scientific community that lays down reflexive rules of practice for how these things should work. And over time, collectively, gradually stabilizes the body of knowledge in such a way that there are generally accepted standards of what counts as an adequate theory, what counts as a valid instrument, and what is meaningful as an observation. These aren't once and for all hard and fast distinctions. They are provisional, sociologically embedded rules of practice, but embedded in a community sufficiently vast, sufficiently stable, and sufficiently conscious of its own history, actually to give an enormous degree of stability and predictability to these processes. But of course, things can change, even radically. And when they change through the mediation of a scientific community, which by its own internal practices of discussion, debate, polemic, peer review, publication, assessment, graduate supervision, and everything else that professional scientists do in all disciplines, from philosophy to particle physics and from anthropology to astronomy, come to believe either that something is wrong with previously accepted theories, that something is inadequate about previously accepted instruments, or that certain observations actually don't mean what we used to think they mean. And this constitutes, to quote a famous book, the structure of scientific revolutions, which are revolutions, in Kuhn's analysis, within a scientific community, and can only be understood as revolutions by reference to that scientific community. Therefore, if we step back a little bit from some of the familiar theoretical frameworks of the 20th century, we will see that the gap between science and culture is less a gap between separate epistemological, existential, or sociological worlds, and more a series of gaps which can't necessarily be superimposed on one another, between modes of analysis and understanding that often have as much in common as they differ. In order to illustrate this and to point to some of the features of this relationship, I'd like to use the Anthropocene as an example. Obviously not an unimportant example. You could argue that it is in some respects one of the most important issues of our time, and it is certainly an issue that goes to the heart of any understanding of what constitutes the problem of human survivability, and perhaps the solutions to the problem of human survivability. I won't go into a lot of detail about what the Anthropocene is taken to mean by geologists, because we're past that point already. Many of you may know that it was originally proposed precisely by geologists as a way of understanding what they saw as the future challenge of identifying the geological and in particular the stratigraphic nature of the world in which we currently live. Geologists, and in particular international cooperation in geology, works through stratigraphic normalization, identifying geological eras and epochs and so on that have precise criteria that allow them to be a shared language for geologists working in different settings, different interdisciplinary projects and paradigms, using different natural languages, and analyzing parts of the Earth that don't necessarily have the same features, morphological features, history and so on, giving them a shared language to understand how the traces of the history of the Earth can be observed through certain techniques on its surface or below its surface today. The hypothesis that we might be entering a new age called the Anthropocene, in other words, the age in which human activity is the primary geological process shaping the surface of the planet, was formulated originally and continues to be discussed in international geological arenas as a stratigraphical problem. How would you know? Intuitively, the idea that we are changing the planet in ways that have become very far-reaching, perhaps in many respects irreversible, is widely accepted. But how would you know exactly, thinking as a hypothetical geologist 20,000, 100,000, 100 million years in the future, when this process started, and how would you identify the strata related to it in the geological record? And that's tricky, because it requires you to think first about what the nature of those transformative processes is, and secondly, about the markers that are likely to survive. And some of these debates are interesting because different choices of markers lead in rather different directions. One possibility, for instance, is to emphasize climate change as the most fundamental marker of the Anthropocene, which means that the geological record will need to be calibrated in terms of atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases and the consequences of those for things like vegetation and other indications that might be preserved in the fossil record indefinitely. Another possibility is to regard our waste as what is most characteristic of our impact on the planet. In which case, what we should be trying to identify is the kinds of waste that will be there for a very, very long time, so that we can indicate for the benefit of future geologists, even if there aren't any. And there probably won't be any geologists around in 100 million years. It's highly unlikely. But still, the whole point of thinking in geological time is to think about a kind of abstract responsibility towards science itself, to give a framework for thinking about the planet that will long overpass the boundaries of human survivability. We might wish to go on for as long as possible. We might wish to get another, 400,000 years of humanoid existence, but I don't think anyone would seriously bet on 100 million. But that's what geologists do. The kinds of waste we produce includes, of course, all the plastics, the metals, the hybrid combinations making up our machines that are likely to be detectable for a very long time because they don't occur naturally. So they will appear at some point in the geological record as a reasonably sharp break, likely date from the mid-50s probably, though of course future geologists won't have distinctions that fine, and we will be able to identify on that basis. A third possibility, and the three could of course be combined, but they will point to somewhat different datings, is mass extinction. The hypothesis that we are currently witnessing the early stages of the sixth mass extinction identified in the history of life on the planet is backed by some worrying evidence, even though it's predictive evidence, therefore not entirely solid, because we don't know exactly how these things unfold over time. We've never had the opportunity to observe a mass extinction in real time. But if there is such a mass extinction, then it will be a very good stratigraphic marker, just as the previous mass extinctions have been used very conveniently to mark the divisions between previous geological era. By extension, because the geological idea of the Anthropocene is thinking about the ways in which human activity transforms the planet, the notion of the Anthropocene has also become, as you know very well, a way of summarizing in global science debate and public debate the idea of a new era of human impact, which is defined by the planetary boundaries, to borrow the phrase that is used by the community of scientists who work on this, that we are currently either breaching or getting very worried about because we have the scientific knowledge that allows us to assess the extent to which we might be breaching them. One of the best known of those planetary boundaries is concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But there are others, and some are judged actually to be more under threat even than CO2 concentrations. Apparently, according to the specialists, the most breached planetary boundary and the one that causes the most worry looking forward is the nitrogen cycle, which is sometimes judged to have been breached already 30 or 40 years ago. As we pump ever more quantities of inorganic nitrogen compounds into our agricultural systems to maintain productivity, way beyond the capacity of the Earth's systems to absorb and metabolize that nitrogen excess. And there are many others. 9 in total in the framework proposed by the International Science Cooperation Future Earth. So the Anthropocene is the name, or the brand name, for a certain scientific understanding of the planetary system. But at the same time, and almost from the moment where the idea emerged in scientific discourse, the Anthropocene has also been the name for an ethical and political understanding of the implications. The literature on what it means to be human in the Anthropocene is as old as the scientific literature on planetary boundaries. Why? I think for a very simple reason. Well, there are several reasons. As a political scientist, you could say because there was a context of green politics in many countries that created favorable conditions for the reception of these ideas. Maybe. But I think more profoundly, and even apart from specific local political considerations, the reason why the Anthropocene was picked up so quickly as an ethical political construct was that it points to a fundamental connection between science and culture that was known to exist in other areas but is really dramatized by it, which is the question of the responsibilities that derive from knowledge. Our knowledge of the problems of the Anthropocene is forward-looking knowledge based on our capacity to model the planetary system in ways that have a reasonable and in some respects very high degree of scientific validity. Because we can predict what might happen, subject to certain assumptions, we have responsibilities to do something about it. That's not an obvious connection. You could say that our ability to observe things going wrong is completely separate from any question about whether we should respond to what's going wrong. But when we're talking about the planet as a whole, it becomes a bit difficult to say we should observe it dispassionately for the purposes of science, but leave to others the question of what to do about it. Not least because our ability to observe dispassionately depends on the survival of the planetary system within which our societies, institutions, values, and so on themselves survive. If we destroy the laboratory, we won't be able to do any experiments. That idea that that knowledge brings responsibility is as old as philosophy. But at the same time, it acquires a particularly sharp edge in the face of the idea, first, that we have such extensive, detailed knowledge about how the planetary system works in an integrated manner, and secondly, that the current state of that knowledge, given the initial conditions that we currently have shaped by recent history, and given reasonable assumptions about how those conditions are likely to change in the reasonably short term of the next 10, 15, 20 years, given in particular the apparent inability of the international community to agree frameworks of action that are of the same order of magnitude as the level of concern expressed by the international community in its formal diplomatic agreements, we have knowledge of impending disaster. We are Cassandra. Now, of course, Cassandra was doomed by Apollo never to be believed. Fortunately, we're not quite in that position. There's a lot of resistance to listening to scientists on these issues, and what the scientists have to say is often more complicated than what decision makers in the public arena would like them to say. But still, we have extensive knowledge of how it might go wrong, and from that follow certain ethical implications. Ignoring that knowledge is not something to be done lightly. But what are the implications? How can we make sense of them? This is a scientific problem at one level, a problem of understanding the planetary system and our place in it, but it's also a cultural problem, a problem of developing what is often called in the literature an Anthropocenic consciousness. And to illustrate this, I'd like to look at some pictures. It's also more fun than just listening to me talk and talk. It's remarkable how much energy has been put into making the Anthropocene visual. And I don't think this is any kind of coincidence. It's not just that it's easier to make pictures and distribute them than it used to be. It is that the very idea of the Anthropocene raises a fundamental problem of representation, in the multiple senses of the word representation. Here's one of the most famous pictures, which I'm sure all of you know, of the multiple dimensions of representation. The frontispiece from one of the original printings of Hobbes' Leviathan, dated 1651. And I hope completely out of copyright. I don't see how anyone could own copyright over this, so I haven't put any indication. I'm sure everyone is familiar, at least in general terms, with Hobbes' theories. The key points about the picture, for those perhaps who've never seen it, is that what we have here is a composite figure, a ruler, a sovereign, made up of subjects. And standing over the earth, as it says in Latin, like the greatest power there is. There is no power over the earth that can be compared with it, from the book of Job, where Leviathan is a mythical creature of enormous power. Leviathan is the political community considered as sovereign. How can you consider a political community, a bunch of people, as a sovereign, capable of unitary action, capable of wearing a crown, holding a scepter of justice, and holding a sword? That's Hobbes' problem. And it's a double problem of representation. A problem of the political processes by which the individual subjects can combine somehow to produce a sovereign through the method of the so-called contract or compact. And secondly, how we can make this meaningful in visual terms. How can we make that abstraction of sovereign composition concrete enough to be grasped even by people who are not philosophers? And this image, which has become justly famous, brilliantly captures the two dimensions in one drawing. This is one part of the problem of representing the Anthropocene, the general problem of making the abstract concrete. It's also more specifically, in the context of the Anthropocene, a reminder of the need to understand what might be an Anthropocenic political community. Who wears the crown? Who wields the sword? Who holds the scepter of justice? And what do those things mean? The crown, in other words, the symbol of authority. The scepter of justice, the symbol of the ability to say what is right and what is wrong. And the sword, the ability to resolve conflicts when they exceed the bounds of justice and authority. How does that work for us today? How does the Anthropocene change it? But of course, there is one thing missing from this picture, just a reminder of the context from which it comes, which is science. Not because Hobbes was uninterested in science, but because for the purposes of this symbolic representation, the science of human nature and government is simply taken for granted. I remind you the title of the original book, Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of a commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil. We could do a whole seminar about what the word ecclesiastical is doing in there, but we won't. But as a book on the relation between religion and politics, Leviathan is as important as it is on the other subjects it deals with. That's a different story. Two modes of representation fused into one image. And it's remarkable how many people are trying to do the same thing at the moment in other areas. Let me just give you some samples. So Hobbes, as I said, representing the idea of sovereignty and creating the sovereign through representation. The Anthropocene, the problem can be phrased as representing the scientifically grounded ideas of planetary independence and fragile planetary boundaries, and creating through representation. Well, what exactly? A consciousness, an understanding, a political community, a worry, a problem? Some pictures. It's interesting how all of these pictures are grasping with the question of how we can get all of that on one page and maybe make the very abstract connections apparent. This comes from the Future Earth literature. Of course, those equations don't actually mean very much. They're not even real equations. They are placeholders for the idea that something fundamentally has changed. And the key point of the picture, other than the picture, is the mismatch of timescales. 4 billion years, 40 years, which is a way of dramatizing. This points? It points, yeah. Which is a way of dramatizing the sheer novelty and scale of the impact of humanity on the planet. Drawing maps and imagining new ways of drawing maps is a fundamental part of rethinking what our relationship is to the planet, the surface of which we inhabit, and the overall dynamics of which are the conditions of possibility of our existence. This is a population cartogram, which renormalizes the surfaces of states in proportion to their population, and obviously produces a very different map of the world from the one we're familiar with from purely geographical projections, and in particular reminds us of just how relatively big Asia is in terms of population. The Anthropocene would call for maps that go way beyond just 2 dimensions or even 3. The idea of planetary boundaries is a reminder that the characteristic processes that make the planet livable have multiple dimensions and interactions that way exceed any kind of simple 2-dimensional drawing. If you want to get the ozone layer, carbon dioxide, the nitrogen cycle, biodiversity, ocean acidity, etc., all on the same picture, then you need something of a pretty radically new nature. Maybe you need something that adds dimensions through artistic cleverness, such as knitting the globe from wool, as a reminder that, in a very real sense, we made it. Not the globe as such, but the planetary system in its current state of fragility. And because we made it, we have the duty to care for it. A reminder also that the planet isn't just a sphere or an ellipsoid moving through space. It is that sphere or ellipsoid as transformed by the full range of our technological interventions. I'm not endorsing any of these pictures. None of them captures everything. Each of them is just a reminder of the need to find a new language, and among other things, a new visual language of representation in order to understand the issues. Art in the Anthropocene, just one of many books that have been published along these lines, encounters among aesthetics, politics, environments, and epistemologies. A nice title. That's a very heterogeneous or hybrid space of intellectual exchange. These aren't necessarily the people who usually talk to one another, but the Anthropocene requires them to if we are to take it seriously. If you do a Google search on Mother Earth, you will see an enormous range of attempts to re-image and reimagination old cultural ideas of Mother Earth as deity, whether or not called Gaia. And the idea that by drawing it in the right way, we might capture the imagination and make concrete the abstraction of the planetary system is widely shared. Whether this picture does that job, we could discuss. Representation isn't just visual in the sense of paintings or drawings. It can also be through other mechanisms, in this case theatrical. This is a film made of Bruno Latour's real-world experiment of conducting climate negotiations with radically new parameters. Latour, who's been one of the major contributors to the philosophy of the Anthropocene, even though interestingly he rejects the word, for reasons that I won't go into, got a group of students to enact climate negotiations over 3 full days in a theater with a mixture of screenplay and a mixture of script rather and improvisation. And one of the key ideas, we collaborated in a small way with this, was to open up the negotiations to things that are not usually present or represented. In addition to students playing the role of representatives of the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia or whatever, there were students representing the oceans. There were students representing future generations. The things, the future of which is fundamentally at stake and which never get anyone to speak for them, which never get, in the purely legal and very straightforward sense of the word, represented. You can also do it through sound. This was just the title of a conference that I happened to find online. Sonic Media Ecologies, Understanding the Anthropocene Through Soundscapes. And in conjunction with his theatrical work, Bruno Latour also put together an exhibition which was exhibited in a number of different places, including here in Karlsruhe, on making things public, atmospheres of democracy. In other words, how can you represent in the staging of a space, including a space within which discussions about the nature of a political community might take place, the characteristic features of the planetary system? And finally, some pictures from a French artist called Chris Morin-Eitner, who produced a series of paintings called Once Upon a Time Tomorrow, Il était une fois demain, which are imaginations of our cities taken over by nature. Because the human race is extinct? Not necessarily. Maybe just because we've stopped living in cities. But this is just an amusing way of dramatizing the question of a future that cannot be imagined just as extrapolation of the past. A future in which the question of the planet and its dynamics becomes internal to the question of civilization and its development. You can do it for London, you can do it for Paris. And he did it for many other places too. In all these images, science and culture come together in what I'll call for these purposes the knot of representation. There's a lot to be said about knots, both as a philosophical conundrum and as mathematical object, but I won't go there. I'll just use the word knot for the moment, which point to the question of the Anthropocene as culture, not by ceasing to be science, because the very idea of the Anthropocene only exists because there is a scientific framework within which it can be formulated. But at the same time, inseparably, the idea of the Anthropocene is a cultural idea. It's both a cultural representation and a challenge to the kind of culture, including the kind of public culture, we would need to survive in it. This leads me to what is not even a conclusion, but just an invitation for discussion in the rest of this conference. Bridging the gap between science and culture is a challenge of representation. It's a challenge of giving meaning to scientific knowledge. It's a challenge of composing the political community defined by that meaning and that knowledge. It is a challenge of developing the science of the meanings we can have or should have or might need. And the science of meanings is the human sciences. That's what they do. They consider how meanings are produced, and in considering how meanings are produced, they produce possible meanings, including meanings that go beyond the meanings being analyzed by the human sciences themselves. The challenge is the challenge of making the abstract concrete. There are many ways of making abstractions concrete. One is the purely technological. You take an idea, and through appropriate technologies, you make it real. You reshape the world in its image. But that's not the only possibility. But any connection between science and culture is a connection that necessarily has the form of making abstractions, which is what science produces, concrete. Concrete through multiple modes of representation. Modes of representation that are about giving an image, a name, a face, a picture to the scientific abstractions, but also composing a political community that is aligned with those abstractions and makes sense in light of them. Which means, of course, that there is no one-way process. This is necessarily a contested process. It is a political process in the sense that contestations of the meanings around the phenomena are part of the phenomena themselves. The science of the Anthropocene doesn't tell us what to do with it. It defines certain parameters within which we need to consider and perhaps struggle over the nature of what to do with it. That is precisely the point. So if this ultimately is what representation means, giving concrete form to some abstraction, whether legal, scientific, philosophical, or artistic, and in the case of the Anthropocene, at the very least, all four of those dimensions at the same time, then asking the question of representing the Anthropocene already bridges the gap between science and culture and reminds us that for most of the purposes about which we care, that gap is actually misleading, not where we think it is, smaller than we think it is, but not necessarily more easy to bridge. Thank you.